Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to just say a big hello and uh, s- lay the groundwork a little bit, and then Jason is going to talk about our the project and what we've learned from it. I just want to say at the outset that this was an extraordinary project to be involved in. I think the Judicial Innovation Fellowship, as you'll hear, was extremely successful, and we got some very deep understanding of some of the challenges of working in courts, but also how far you could get with the right motivation, the right organizational culture, and in particular, the right fellows. And we ended up with three spectacular fellows who were able to come in and really change how, not just technically what courts did, but how they thought about their technologies, both their user-based, thinking about user experience when they were designing what they were doing, but also thinking about how they could use their data and how they could simplify their data structures to be more transparent. So our fellows are spectacular. Jason will tell you that. I also though want to thank the Institute and Natalie Roisman for her support in this project. I don't think there are a lot of law schools where you could do something like this and feel that it's really part of the mission of the Law Center to do something like this. And before I hand it over to Jason, I want to say the biggest thank you to Jason, who could was extraordinary and put incredible amount of work into designing the program, into supervising picking the courts, supervising the fellows. And it's been an amazing journey that we've been on together. And I can't wait to continue to be doing more work with Jason. So with all that, I'm going to hand it over to, I didn't say who I was, Tanina Rostain at Georgetown Law Center. I'm the co-founder of the Judicial Innovation Fellowship with Jason Tashea. So Jason, take it away.
Thank you, Tanina. And thank you all for joining us. You got an invite to be here today because at some point in the last 2.5 or so years, you spent time with us, talking us through things that we didn't understand, explaining to us how fellowship programs work, how courts could be better, how the justice system can function differently. And we did our best to incorporate all of that feedback into the program that we ran over the last couple of years. So we wanted to take this opportunity at the end of the pilot to speak with you all specifically about what your advice, your time, your effort led to. And it was, as Tanina pointed out, something quite special, I think. And so for the sake of today's presentation, by way of roadmap, first off, just resettling ourselves around why did we feel this project was necessary? What did we do to stand it up and to execute it? And then what were the outcomes? And then last, and I think the thing Tanina and I are most excited about is question and answer and comments from you all, poking and prodding about what we've just been up to for the last couple of years. So to jump into it, maybe to jump into it. There we go. To just get a sense of scope of the issue itself. So every year there's about 83 million cases filed in state courts alone. And presuming about two parties per case, that's 166 million parties, whether they're individuals, governments, agencies, or corporations a year that make up state court users. That puts it about on par, or state courts in total, with about the user base of Amazon Prime, which should illustrate how large of a system, confederated systems, the state courts are. But it also illustrates that this is a national problem. This isn't a local problem in specific cities or particular counties. This is a national issue. And drilling down into that data, we know that 1 in 5 Americans every year are going to experience a civil or a criminal legal problem. So a full 20%. Which really makes the state courts, at the end of the day, the front door of our democracy, and that front door is broken for many people. A majority of civil cases within the United States every year, at least one party is not going to be represented by an attorney, which means that the person themselves, regardless of their competency, their literacy, their ability to speak English well, is going to have to navigate their existential crisis through our legal system. And this includes eviction and housing, child custody, benefits access. So these are literally life and death issues that are meant to be litigated in the courts that people are navigating on their own. And because there's so many people coming through the court system without legal support, it puts downward pressure on the courts to try to do better, to try to close the gap between this population and the justice that they're so deserved. But it's a challenge, and there's three structural issues that we identified early on that complicate courts doing better by the public generally. So first and foremost, decreased budgets. Since the Great Recession, courts have just been hammered budgetarily. They saw huge cuts about a decade and a half ago, and their budgets never really bounced back. There was a brief moment during the pandemic where TARP money and other emergency funds were made available to the courts, but that was a brief moment in time where court budgets seemed somewhat healthy again, and we're beginning to see those decreases or kind of a reversion to the post-recession mean happening again. So no money is going to certainly hamper ability to do more by these institutions. Secondly, they're risk adverse by nature. The common law systems are predicated on precedent, literally looking backwards to know how to fix a problem today. And that is not necessarily the way to support innovation or to take swings at something from a different perspective. And then last, the private vendors are hampering innovation as well, because they want the courts to be contracted to them to do all of the things that they claim that they can do as a company. They hinder interoperability, transparency, access to data, and user responsive updates in a way that literally hurts people. One of the major court technology companies in the United States, their technology has run so poorly that it has led to people being falsely arrested, as well as being overheld on their jail sentences. So these are not just technical issues, but real life constitutional issues that bad technology is perpetrating in the courts around the United States. So with these things in mind, we wanted to build off of the experiences of Tech Congress, the Presidential Innovation Fellowship, Coding It Forward, and others to build a program that would bring technologists into the state court system to be able to confront these very limitations. So that was the big idea that we had around the Judicial Innovation Fellowship. We started with a national call for proposals from courts around the United States. We received 18 applications from 14 courts from every region of the US. And what we were looking for were proposals that tackled problems that were common across courts in the US, projects that had the potential to either be scalable or replicable, as well as those that improved access to justice in those jurisdictions and beyond. For the promising proposals that we received, we developed with them and scoped statements of work with the partners themselves. We did this with 5 individual courts, and this process helped us figure out kind of the last thing we were looking for in courts for this pilot program, which was who plays well with others. And going through the development process of the statements of work really showed us who was going to be dynamic, open to feedback, and could demonstrate buy-in in a program like this for the projects that they proposed. And so with that, we began to execute on our theory of change, which was really that we could place fellows, technology fellows, whether they were designers or technologists in nature, in local courts, execute on a discrete project, while doing so, increasing the cultural capacity within that court for modern approaches to technology, modern approaches to design, and modern approaches to data. And so through that process, through that theory of change and vetting these applications that we received, it led us to 3 courts in the US. The Utah and Kansas state courts, as well as Hamilton County, Tennessee's General Session Court. And what we ended up doing in these particular courts was a little bit different in each. Design projects in Utah and Kansas. In Utah, we were focused on improving the design of their self-help resources. These are those resources for individuals that are trying to navigate the system without an attorney, but as well as build internal capacity at their self-help center so that they could better test and innovate or iterate the products that they were developing. In Kansas, also a design project, was a little bit different. They were focused on trying to bring electronic filing to the self-represented litigant population. Currently in Kansas, if you do not have an attorney, you cannot file your case online or receive documents online. through their filing system. And they know that that's a gap that they need to close. So they wanted a designer to help teach them and go through the process of researching, designing, and prototyping what a user-friendly portal would look like for e-file within the state. And then in Hamilton County, Tennessee, we had our data project. Their application was unique in that it was both the county mayor and the county court system that applied jointly because they wanted to better understand the intersection between their civil court system and their criminal court system as it affects poverty, recidivism, and homelessness in the county. The challenge that they have is that their civil and criminal courts run two different data systems and they do not talk to each other. And so they wanted to be able to dig into how do you break down that barrier and make data more operable in the county. The challenge after identifying these projects and narrowing the scope, of course, was then to find 3 people that could then execute on the work itself. And so similar to how we looked for court projects, we had a national call for applications. We ultimately received 46 applications. 69% of applicants were people of color, 58% were female or non-binary. And through our 4-step hiring process, which we illustrate more thoroughly in the report, that we undertook with our court partners, we found 3 motivated individuals looking to work in public service, comfortable with the uncertainty of a new project and a new bureaucracy, and with the technical expertise to do the work. And those people were Berenice Ramirez, Catherine Albrecht, and Emily Lapolis. And back in September of 23, they came and joined us at Georgetown with our court partners, where we kicked off a week-long training to center ourselves around what these projects are and how we were going to tackle them. And then they off-boarded 11 months later in August of last year. So with all of that, how did we do? And I'm happy to say that in a word, we can sum it up as great, both in regards to the technical wins and the cultural wins that we saw in all 3 jurisdictions. So on the technical side of things, each fellow was able to execute on their scoped statement of work. In Utah, Berenice was able to develop user personas, test protocols, and a UX wiki for the court to use and to further build on into the future. She simplified user journeys for people trying to use court products to navigate their divorces. She created button standardization for the first time across the Utah self-help web pages. This was a universal change to Utah's courts and their websites. She also redesigned forms. Their certificate of service form is now a Berenice GIF designed form that is slowly rolling out around the state. In Kansas, similarly, Emily was able to execute on developing personas. She did significant research into digital e-file services that already exist on the market and developed a sprawling prototype to show what a better, more usable version of that service could look like. This all queued up Kansas's next steps in regards to what they're going to do, which is a good side note. One of the ways that we scoped these projects, and Kansas's maybe typifies it, is that we were looking for projects that were the next link in the chain that the court was undertaking. And Kansas was very specific. They've been exploring e-file for self-represented litigants for some time. They don't know what a good e-file portal would look like. And that was the gap that they needed filled. And that was what we scoped for. And that was the work that Emily did while she was there. In Tennessee, Kat did a full audit of the court's data infrastructure, both in the civil and criminal courts. She established the first of its kind software documentation process. Their criminal justice system, data system in Hamilton County is homegrown. It's about 20 years old, and there's never been software documentation whatsoever. So as people turned over in the IT department, that institutional knowledge would always leave with them. And that is no longer an issue going forward. She also identified dead functionality and usability shortcomings within the software, not a user designer herself. To be able to fill that gap, she brought in US Digital Response to come and build on her work and make usability updates to that system to try to decrease the error rate of inputs into their data system. She's also continuing her work with them. She is in her full-time job a tenured track associate professor at Georgia State in their criminology department, and she's working on formalizing their error response process with continuing support from us at the Judicial Innovation Fellowship. And so While all the technical work was quite impressive and we would have been happy with that alone, what we were able to see was really getting at what our theory of change was that these discrete projects and a new perspective being brought into the courts can actually lead to a larger cultural and systemic change within those institutions. And we're happy to say that we saw that across all three jurisdictions as well. So in Utah, Veronesa spent the first 3 months, about till December of 23, doing research. She traveled around the state to rural and urban jurisdictions across Utah, figuring out where's the status of the tools that are already being used across the state, what's working, what's not working, talking with litigants, judges, and clerks. And she came back, and not only did she build those user personas, but she started to give presentations about them, first to her own office, and then more broadly across the courts. And the courts reported back that having just those user personas alone was a way to build empathy and understanding with the self-represented litigant population that was currently lacking across certain parts of the court. But not only that, her research was they responded so well to it that other departments in the court system started to reach out to get her help on user design that led her to start running office hours for offices outside of the office that she was detailed to for the sake of the fellowship, uh, which kind of shows her scalability just within the state alone within the time that she was allotted. But her work also catching the attention of not only her bosses in the Self-Help Center, but elsewhere in the court system is helping fuel a statewide rule change to their civil procedure system. So Civil Procedure Rule 10 in Utah is the rule that defines what civil courts look like in the state of Utah. And her usability work has informed what that proposed rule change will look like, building a more usable system going forward. It's cleared the first two major hurdles, uh, and we are hoping that it will clear the final hurdles and become a formal adoption within the state. But it clearly shows the ability of just something as simple as building user personas and doing user research can lead to statewide change. Not enough. I don't know how she fit everything into the time that she was allotted. This was an 11-month program, but she also worked with the Self-Help Center on their product and project management approach with the help of John Grant, who was one of our facilitators during the training. The center adopted Kanban boards, is now using the product management software Notion, and has incorporated process mapping into their process. And the court reported that this was something that they wanted to do for a while, but they did not have the internal capacity or expertise to do it. But Veronesa filled that gap, and now they're taking that work forward, even though the fellowship has come to an end. And maybe the biggest note in Utah and the best gold star for us as a program is that Veronesa proved her value so well that the courts now realize that this is not something that they can do internally, but they need to hire for. And so on account of the work that she had done there, proving the value of an in-house designer, the Utah State courts are putting together the funding to be able to create a designer position for the first time in the Self-Help Center. And we saw similar wins in Kansas and Tennessee as well. The user design work that Emily undertook in Kansas is now a part of the conversation as Kansas goes forward. This was not something that Kansas reported before the program, but as one of the benefits of the program, people have a basis in the basics of user experience and why it matters to the work that they do as court administrators. Maybe even more impressively, because she worked with people within the courts building this process and building these prototypes, it helped court IT realize that this is something they could be doing internally the whole time. Just by simply being there and being the example that Emily was, IT is now considering building the e-file system themselves as opposed to relying on some of the less than desirable vendor options that are out there. And similarly, there's a cultural legacy in Tennessee. One of the big things that Kat and her government partners in both the mayor's office and the courts focused on early was building coalitions, because this was a multi-branch, multi-agency effort across the entire civil and criminal justice systems within Hamilton County. They created two different coalitional groups. One was top level, and one was the line people that are working with data, either input or manipulation, in the court in their day-to-day jobs. And this turned out to be a phenomenal opportunity for consensus building, which I got to see firsthand. As someone who's worked with governments for the last 10 years, I've never quite seen a series of government actors coalesce in the way that they did in Hamilton County. And these opportunities to come together quarterly was, I think, a big part of that. Not to say that obviously the personalities of Hamilton County were gelling before we came, but we gave them a platform to come together even more so. And so these committees are staying active even though the program is over, because they see such value with coming together and having conversations about their data infrastructure and data sharing in Hamilton County. And similar to Utah, Cat also made the argument for a full-time employee, which was proposed in an initial draft of the mayor's budget last year. So not only just good for courts where we see these technical and cultural wins, but also our fellows themselves reported that they were able to increase skills, especially on the soft skill side of things. Kat talked about not actually feeling like she was much of a coalitional person or a people person, which is remarkable if you've ever met her before the program, but having gone through the program, she can see that now as a new arrow in her quiver. Similarly, the fellows talked about building competency in these boundary spanning roles and having to be able to better translate their technical work to a lay audience, which was a big part of what we hired for to begin with. And then all three said that they're more likely to work in public service going forward than they were before the program started. So this is all fantastic. We're very happy with all of the outcomes that we saw, both technical and cultural. So what did we learn, the program itself, having gone through this process? And the report has more things if you care to get into the weeds, but the four that I think are the best to have a conversation with today are the ones that follow. One is that this works, right? You can put a tech fellowship within court systems and you can get real impactful results for the institution, for the fellows, and the community that the court is serving. These are not programs just for the legislative and executive branches, which is what the assumption has been before JIF came along. And it proves the theory of change that we have, that these short-term technical projects can lead to lasting impact in the jurisdictions that we work. Secondly, as typified by the experience Kat had, these are people projects. When I visited her in Hamilton County last year, I had the opportunity to watch her win over the juvenile court that was not happy that we were there, did not trust a DC institution coming into their county. And by the end, she had invites to barbecues, to plays, to ride-alongs, to look at the code and do code review of the juvenile data system. And ultimately, that's soft skills. Those are people projects. That's not anything someone with technical capacity is alone going to be able to accomplish. Third, and this might be a lesson relearned, as I think this is a common headache found among the court modernization community, is that scaling projects in this space is extremely hard, and that's for a number of different reasons. One is that funding is scarce for court modernization work. There's an assumption that the funding should be coming from the government and not from other private sources. And we can debate that. I think it needs to be a mix of those things. But also, there is, I believe, this struggle that I was surprised to learn about a half dozen fundraising calls in, is I initially started to believe that this was a good program and I needed to sell the program. And it was so good, people would give us money. But after about the first 6 calls, I realized I'm not selling the program. I have to convince these people that courts matter, that courts are a vector for social change. And that's a failure on our part in the court modernization world, to not have this be a well-known fact that courts have very scalable impact across a lot of issues that philanthropies and other donors care about, whether it's economic, racial, or gender disparities, or any other type of gap that we're looking to close through philanthropic and nonprofit work. It all winds up at the courts at some point in time, and we need to be better at communicating that to these groups, because until we do, it's going to be hard to scale these projects on account of limited funding. Second, courts are balkanized. This is not a new finding. This is just something we run up against every time. Even in the same court system, county to county, you're going to come across completely different approaches to how to run a court. And that will always put a ceiling on aspects of replicability and scalability of projects in the space. It's not that they can't be overcome, it's just one of the many challenges. And then last is an issue of vendor capture. As I mentioned up top, there's a lack of options in the space, and specifically one company, Tyler Technologies, really dominates the court technology space, and their software is just bad. And it's not just bad in the way that it's leading to false arrests, as I mentioned, but it's bad in that it intentionally is not interoperable. Their APIs are limited in functionality. There's no documentation. Changes happen to them all the time, meaning that if you wanted to plug in a different project or you wanted to pull data regularly, it's going to break constantly. And so it decreases the ability for those courts to try new things, as well as their ability to share the data they do have regularly. So the lack of competition in the space is leading to this opacity and lack of innovation. And then last, maybe our biggest finding is that GIF is simultaneously too big and too small. So when I say too big, I mean that project to project, it's on the expensive side. We paid about $195,000 per site. That was the fellow's salary. That was fringe, travel, training, project budgets. And that doesn't include overhead costs at Georgetown, my salary, other folks that we paid to help get the program up and running. And while I think the ROI, the return on investment, speaks for itself, frequent feedback was that this is an expensive project. It's too big for what we're getting out of it. But simultaneously, it's also too small for the scope of the problem. There's somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 courts within the United States. And it's shocking to learn that we do not actually know how many courts there are in the United States. It's another area for research going forward. But even if we 100x our budget from this first year and we're able to hire 300 fellows a year, it would take us somewhere between 16 and 33 years to place a fellow in each court, making us too small for the scope of the issue at hand. So this is all to say GIF should exist. A program like the Judicial Innovation Fellowship should exist, but in a larger court modernization effort that's paired with efforts to increase communications across courts, decrease balkanization, and build commons infrastructure for the benefit of every court, and not just the individual courts that we are placing individuals in. So that brings us to what's next. And there's kind of four big ideas that are upstream systemic issues that we see that we want to spend some time with and see if we can't improve on them in some way. So first is around communication. We need to make sure that people know that courts matter and that courts are vectors for social change, for issues that people care about, whether it's houselessness, domestic violence, criminal justice reform. Courts do matter, and the way that they're administered and the way that they function matter as well. Just beyond just, a judge's ruling, there are all sorts of other touch points that we can improve on with a program like the Judicial Innovation Fellowship, but we need to make sure people know that, and currently they generally don't. Secondly, we need to be promoting opportunities for the development and adoption of commons infrastructure. And in this case, we need to be promoting a lot of good work that's already happening out there. The Free Law Project, Suffolk Law, Stanford Law are building technologies and standards that are scalable, that are good, that can improve courts nationwide. And we need to just be there to assist them on adoption, promotion, and general cheerleading to make sure that happens. But there's also policy opportunities as well. We expect the Open Courts Act to come back in the new Congress. And this would not only create national standards around cybersecurity, data structure, and access to federal court data, but it would also develop a brand new federal court data infrastructure. It would replace the PACER system. And the way that the legislation is currently written, any court within the United States, regardless of how big or how small, would have access to that source code, creating a commons infrastructure for case management that simply has never existed in the United States. And that would be a sea change, the likes the courts of the US have never experienced. And we need to see it pass, and we need to be promoting it and talking about it to make sure that it can finally get across the hurdle. Third, anti-competition and monopolization in the court vendor space. So not only like the passage of the Open Courts Act would be a great defeat for that monopolization, because there would be another option for case management systems in the United States, But this issue is overlooked by attorneys general, by the DOJ, by the FTC, and policymakers generally. And it's another gap that we need to be able to fill through research and better communications about this issue. And we're going to get a jump on that next week. Actually, we have a panel at the American Bar Foundation's conference in Phoenix, where we're going to be talking about these very issues and how the monopolization of court and justice system technology is limiting access to data, excuse me, and ultimately the development of AI within the space. And then last, and building on that idea, is that procurement needs to be more a part of the discussion for court modernization. Courts have a lot of unilateral muscle that they can flex in regards to how they write their requests for proposals, as well as how they vet technology projects. And this is a huge opportunity for them to just do better and to force more out of the people that come and say that they can provide a service to ensure that they're getting a service that is not only correct for that court, but for the public at large. And so I know Tanina has other thoughts about what's next for us, and so I'm going to let her jump in here.
Thanks so much, Jason. I'm going to keep my thoughts a minimum because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A and your comments, suggestions, and questions. So these draw on and follow on what Jason's talking about. One piece of what we're doing is thinking hard about communications and seeing the extent to which we can learn lessons from other attempts successful to get stories out there about courts, about how courts affect people's lives, and learn, for instance, from voices from civil justice and organizations that actually have been able, via telling stories, and they can be stories, in factual or fictional, about what courts are about, so that people understand in the same way that they understand a lot about the criminal justice system, they might begin to understand much more about what it means to be entangled in the civil justice system. So that's one piece, and Jason's been thinking very hard and taking the lead on that piece of what we're doing next. Another piece has to do with this question of how many courts and how expensive would it be to really modernize courts. So we've gone back and forth about how much money it would take to move the courts. And we always think the court, and as Jason said at the beginning, when we talk about problems, we always think it would be a huge amount of money, but we really don't know how much that is. We don't know how courts are using their resources right now. And Jason mentioned procurement practices. We don't have a handle systematically on procurement practices and how those are hanging up courts around. And so we want to take a sort of bird's eye systematic view on budget, procurement practices, and see what we can learn from the most successful court systems that are out there, from the point of view of what kind of organizational culture they have and how they think about the money that they have and how they spend it. And so we're beginning of that project. We've been collecting budgets around courts and budgets dedicated to technology. We want to see to what extent the court capture problem is how much it's weighing down courts, and to be able then to have some best practices or lessons learned from taking a much more systemic view. Because it seems, again, going back to the last point that Jason made about being both too big and too small, the approach of going court by court by court is challenging and and one of the things that didn't happen is that we didn't suddenly create a groundswell of more courts joining what we were doing, and there are a lot of barriers to doing that. And so we want to think hard about what it would take in terms of thinking about budgets and things, conversations, in terms of thinking about organization to be much more systemic in change, and what kind of levers might be out there at some point. Part of it might be the Open Courts Act, of course, it's really important. There might be a day when funding for upgrading court technology, data systems, and user-facing design might come with grants from Congress and tied to particular congressional uh, uh, subject matter interests. And that might be a way of getting courts to come along without having to try to persuade them one by one that this is a good idea. But those are sort of the ideas that we're beginning to explore now, starting with thinking how how do we take a systematic view, a nationwide view of the problems and the ways of fixing them. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions from our and comments from our attendees.
Yeah, and just to say thank you again. This project would not have been possible without you all here in the room and many others. And so thank you for helping us be successful. It was a hard road, but ultimately very much worth it. So to the folks in Georgetown, to the folks outside of Georgetown, and everyone in between, thank you. And I'm looking forward to the questions. And there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen that if you want to drop questions in, that's the place to do it.
Looks like Kumar raised his hand. Let me see how to unmute you so you can talk. Give us this 1 second. And
I got him.
you got him? Okay, great.
Kumar, you should be able to talk.
Hey, I guess two questions. One is, you know, these sort of civic fellowships always have this dynamic of they're expensive and they're hard to sustain because you're covering the personnel costs. I guess one question is, do you see a world in which over time these can be publicly funded? Obviously, Department of Justice sometimes does grant making down to states, and so there's like a federal funding or at the state level. So what is like the prospect for over time making the case for this being an actual area for public funding, where then things like the Georgetown effort can be doing training or sourcing or other things, which looks like bridge funding, but the kind of like operational cost of just funding people's salaries can get covered. And then I guess the second question would just be, you know, in this sort of current political environment, are there some places where you think that there would be energy on, hey, actually, having these sort of technologists and others can actually help you save costs or can actually help be an important part of public safety or something else that, might be sort of relevant as state leaders or others are coming in and thinking about, what are good bets?
Great. Yeah. So to take those in order, excuse me. Could these be publicly funded? One of the things that we explored during the pilot was to see if we could get states to buy into at least a portion of the cost of bringing a fellow in. And by and large, the answer was no. And a part of that was that their pandemic era funding was running out. And so they were about to go back to their old budget. So they were feeling a little bit tighter financially than they had been years previously. Uh, Second is that I think at the state level, at least for it to be successful, we would need or want to establish a Utah State Courts Judicial Innovation Fellowship, where there is a system that it would keep coming through that particular court, and they would have dedicated funding for it every year. Because in a place like Utah, where budgets are decided every other year, it's a long timeline to be able to have that discussion and to be able to get that funding in place if you're going to be successful. So establishing it as a permanent position within the courts that would be able to float through different departments might be one way to go about it, in a way to get legislative buy-in. But at the same time, to your point about the political aspects of things, the courts were under attack in Utah specifically from the legislature due to concerns about DEI and other issues. And so there's other headwinds afoot than just getting money on the table and convincing legislators that this is a good idea. At the federal level, I do think that there's opportunity there as well. One of our funders this time around was the State Justice Institute, which is a federal pass-through for court innovation, modernization, and research work. And they funded both our work in Tennessee and in Kansas. And so there's opportunities to work there again. They get the theory of change. They supported us. And so I think there's opportunity there. and maybe potential in the future. Who knows what's going to happen going forward? The Department of Justice, for the time being, has an Office of Access to Justice. The last time Trump was president, he got rid of that office. We don't know what's going to happen again. So there's a lot of open questions that we just simply don't know the answers to in regards to who's going to be around to even want to play ball. Tanina, do you have anything else to add to those
No,
questions?
no, I think that's great. Thanks, Jason. I think the answer is it's hard. It's not clear that making an efficiency argument is necessarily going to work here because who that's sufficient for it depends who it's sufficient for. The courts, for some actors, the courts are working perfectly fine the way they are. But it may not be working for the people who are being brought into them on, evictions or debt collection or criminal justice issues. But so I think it's a kind of a tricky. It would be nice to be able to make that argument. It's not obvious to me how easy it is to make that argument. Um, can I jump to the questions that are in the Q&A? The first one from Anonymous. Thank you for your question, Anonymous. Could you handicap the chances for the Open Courts Act? I can't. I don't know if you can, Jason. I think the conversations start and then they stop. And like lots of things in Congress, it's very hard to predict what's happening over there.
Yeah, so Senator Wyden's office is one of the leaders on the bill. And in speaking with their team last year, the general sense was that it could get an upvote in the Senate, but it was being held up in the committee in the House because Darrell Issa, who I believe is the ranking member of that committee, wanted to hold it up for whatever reasons that he may have. So it feels like one of those easy bipartisan wins. And the Wyden office has been very active in rewriting the legislation in a way that keeps the federal courts happy because before they were the ones torpedoing it because it affects their PACER is a financial slush fund for the federal courts. And so this was going to impact them financially. And they think that they've worked around that. So it's anyone's guess, especially with how tight the margins are going to be in the House. I don't really know what's going to happen there going forward.
Do you want to take Ruth's question or I can?
Sure. So we have not done that. And I don't know where you want to go with it. I have lots of negative things to say of why we haven't done that, but I don't know if
Yeah.
that's
Let me
productive.
let me let me answer in a very short way. About I'd say 5, 6, maybe 8 years ago, I tried to begin to have productive conversations around access to justice with the major court vendor. And at the time, it was as if it was an afterthought. It hadn't really been, it wasn't on the radar screen of that vendor. And since then, the conversations that I've had suggest that it's not going to go much further than that. So the short answer is no, we haven't tried because it hasn't been there haven't been avenues, channels to have productive conversations about that we've seen. If there are, please, happy email us and tell us how we should go about doing that. Be happy to have those conversations.
Yeah,
Can I
I
jump into
think,
yeah.
well, just to complement that, like Tyler has hired access to justice people specifically to do that work, and they would be our entry point into that discussion. However, the people that take those jobs never end up staying very long, which I think reflects where that issue is as a priority for them, and also limits our ability to start those conversations. But again, to Tanya's point, we would take the opportunity should it arise.
Natalie, thank you for being here, and also especially thank you for your incredible support for this program all these years. Um, so Natalie Roisman, who's the executive director of the Tech Institute at Georgetown, asks, is there a way to harness the attention paid to criminal justice system reforms to move access to civil justice forward? If not, why not? So that is actually what many people have been trying to do. It's very hard because the criminal injustice problems are so vivid and have been, and the stories around them have been so powerful. Um, and it's much harder to tell those kinds of stories about civil justice issues. So that's a piece of it. The other piece of it, though, and this is where part of the conversation is going is to point out the extent to which people who have criminal justice problems also have civil justice problems. It's the same people who are struggling and who are entangled in the criminal justice system, and their family members are entangled in the criminal justice system, and who have issues with debt, issues with eviction, issues with family law problems. And so making a case for how it's the same people is one avenue for having those conversations. I should note too, though, that criminal justice reform itself and funding in that area has shrunk. It's not what it was quite a few years ago. And so even in that area, and I know there are people on this call who could speak more knowledgeably to that than me, but even in that area, I understand that there isn't the kind of funding that there was before that.
Yeah, I think that's right. We definitely, one of the things we tried to frame ourselves as early on was neither criminal justice nor civil justice, but just a holistic justice. Because as we noted, civil issues can become criminal issues can become civil issues, but that pipeline metaphor is not where the criminal justice funding narrative is. And I think this goes back to the communications piece, like that infrastructure that we're talking about, that we're working on, whether it's user design or data or cybersecurity, is kind of like the plumbing in the courthouse. It doesn't really care what docket you're on. It just has to work. And we're just not there yet convincing that group of funders that that's true and deserves the attention.
Should I jump? We're moving fairly quickly just because I want to make sure we get everyone's
Sure.
question. Should I take the next question if that's okay, Jason?
Sure.
Okay. So this is anonymous, could be our last anonymous or different anonymous. What are your thoughts on funding prizes or other competition style efforts now that you've run a competitive opportunity? Do they have sustainability problems, or is the idea to kickstart question motivated by the new DOJ prize? My view is that the DOJ prizes and funding like that are good to call attention to and kind of lift up different interesting, important, initiatives, approaches, creative solutions to problems. They're not going to solve what is a systemic nationwide problem. It's just not, I mean, you would have to add many, many, many zeros. I think the Access to Justice Prize that you mentioned has the possibility of getting $50,000 at the end of it. That's not even a drop in the bucket when it comes to the change that needs to happen. And as Jason pointed out, it's an infrastructure plumbing. A big chunk of it is an infrastructure plumbing problem. And so to think about it, that plumbing is not something sexy from the point of view of prizes, right? And so some sort of understanding of why the infrastructure has to be fixed and communicating why that's so important for people's lives we need to learn to communicate that better, and then we need to really get our arms around what it would really cost, what kind of initiatives would really change the larger landscape. So that's
And it's
um,
not for lack of trying on our part. We applied to
oh,
plenty
yeah.
of competitions and funding opportunities that simply didn't materialize. So thank you for the question. Maya, your question on particular regions where we would have outsized impact. We were agnostic on region and very much focused on the context of the court and the project itself. Um, and that was what I think helped us define success, is we were willing to work anywhere in state, tribal, local, or territorial courts. And the ones that rose to the top would show themselves to be the most dynamic, to have the best concept of the problem that they're trying to solve, and the resources and attention to continue the work after the fellowship was over. So um, we didn't really consider locality so much. I think it's also notable that all three of the jurisdictions we ended up working with were deep red politically. And it didn't matter in the slightest in regards to getting the work done that we felt was important for access to justice work. So it also speaks to, I guess, the bipartisanship nature of kind of the work that we're focused on.
So Mary asks, what can you say about the receptivity by judges and clerks and other court officials to the project beyond the discrete projects? And have we presented our terrific findings to a broader swath of judicial and other officials? And what pushback do you get more broadly on the project implementation by court officials? The general reaction that I've gotten when I've talked about the project is, that's wonderful. people, the audience, the judges and court administrators we talk to think it sounds great and say, wish we had the money to do that, wish we could do that. What are you doing next for fellows? And that's the general response. So there isn't pushback about the idea. It's more courts saying we can't do that now because of X, Y, or Z. And that's that those are the barriers that we identified even from the beginning. Jason.
And to typify it, Kat's work in Tennessee, she was asked to present her findings in front of the county council, which is a deep red, very skeptical group of people. And they were completely bought in on the work that she did and the direction that the mayor and the courts want to go. And we didn't know that that was going to be the outcome. But again, I think it speaks to the receptivity of these types of projects and maybe has some chances, to Kamar's earlier point about potential political headwinds coming forward. These types of projects, I think, can skirt around the worst of it.
So Catherine's takeaway, hi Catherine, thank you for being here, is that we might want to think about a kind of network that brings in lobbyists, not tied to specific institutions and protecting or increasing their funding, and but to the broader commitments to fixing courts and civil justice. And I think it's a great idea. My inclination is to think that we don't quite understand enough about the funding and the problem itself on a systemic basis to do that. But maybe I'm being too cautious, and maybe that's what we should be doing next. I think it's a fabulous idea.
And part of the communications piece that we'll be publishing on soon gets to the fact that judicial elections around the United States have become fraught and expensive, and there's more attention on them now than ever before. And the access to justice community has so far abdicated its role on educating candidates on why these issues are important and the public on why they should care and be voting for judges that pay heed to these issues. And so I think, complementing your point about lobbyists, we need to be involved on the political end of things as well as court races become more contested.
And Karen is the last comment question with the spectacular suggestion, which we'll take you up on, Karen. Thank you for being here. Any chance of a presentation on this at NCSC and Conference of Chief Justices convenings, maybe a CJ resolution, etc. I know Zach is on the call, and so we should continue the conversation with him. And we should definitely reach out to NCSC and the conference to see if we can do a presentation on it and see the extent to which they would want to back a sort of a resolution that suggests replication across many different courts.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Thank you, Karen. And that puts us at the end of our questions. And Karen Martin, thank you also for offering your assistance going forward. And thank you all for being here and for being a part of this project. It was a big thing and a pretty cool thing to get done. And to be on the other side of it is quite amazing. So thank you again for all the support in whatever fashion that support was provided. We couldn't have done this without all of you and many others. So thank you.
And we will stay in touch. We see your suggestions, questions, suggestions are great, and there will be more to come. So we very much look forward to bringing you into all of the conversations that we're continuing to have around this.
Thank you all very much. Take care.
Bye, everybody.